The wind was trying to kill her. The sandstorm was trying to bury her. And the 9 men below were 3 seconds away from dying because a lieutenant who outweighed her by 100 pounds had spent 48 hours calling her a doll. Elena Vance pressed her cheek against the stock of a rifle, nearly as long as she was tall alone on a rock ledge 3,000 meters above the valley floor, and she made a choice. Not the choice the army gave her. The choice the mountain demanded. She exhaled. She squeezed. The bullet was already in the air before anyone down there knew she existed. If this story hits you the way it hit me, subscribe right now. Follow this channel to the very end and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The C-13. Oh, touched down hard, the way military aircraft always do, like the runway owes it something. The rear ramp dropped with a hydraulic groan, and the desert heat hit like a fist. It didn't creep in. It arrived all at once, pressing down on everything and everyone with the weight of a verdict. Elena Vance hopped off the ramp. Not stepped. Hopped. Her boots hit the concrete with a solid, deliberate thud, and she adjusted the duffel strap cutting into her shoulder without breaking stride. At 4 feet 9 inches, her frame was built small and lean, all compact muscle, under a white deep V-neck sports bra and military camouflage pants that moved with her like a second skin. Her long, dark brown hair was pulled back, but the wind at the edge of the tarmac found the loose strands and pulled them across her face. She didn't reach up to fix them. She was already scanning. The airfield smelled of jet fuel and baked earth, the kind of smell that tells you immediately that you are a long way from anywhere comfortable. Elena kept walking, adjusting her center of gravity against the pull of the duffel, and that was when she heard it. Check it out. Did someone order a mascot? The laughter came from the shade of the hangar. Sharp, masculine, casual. The kind of laughter that doesn't even have the decency to be cruel. It was worse than cruel. It was amused. Elena did not stop walking. She had heard that exact laugh in boot camp. She had heard it in sniper school. She had heard it at every deployment briefing since she earned her qualification tab, and she had learned something very specific about that laugh. Reacting to it gave it power. Ignoring it took the power back. She turned toward the group of men sitting on crates in the shade. SEAL Team Alpha. There were 7 of them, and they looked the way special operations always looked, like they had been assembled from a different set of blueprints than the rest of humanity. Arms covered in tattoos, tactical beards, the particular kind of silence that men carry when they know they are lethal, and they know you know it. The man at the center of gravity for the whole group was enormous, 6'4", maybe more, eyes like chipped gray stone. He had the posture of someone who had never once in his adult life been told to sit down. He looked down at her and tilted his head like she was a math problem he hadn't expected on the test. "You lost, sweetheart," Lieutenant Graves said. "Humanitarian aid tent is on the other side of the airfield." Elena extended her papers. "Specialist Elena Vance," she said. "Attached scout sniper, upcoming operation." The silence that followed was the kind that has texture. The men stopped cleaning their weapons. Graves took the papers with 2 fingers, like he was handling something slightly inconvenient, and flipped through them with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who had already decided what he thought before reading a single word. "Vance," he read. Then he looked back down at her. He looked at her boots. He looked at her rifle case. He looked at her face, which gave him nothing. "You're the sniper." "Yes, sir." "Command said they were sending support, not a—" He paused. He searched. "A doll." The man behind him, a wall of muscle named Miller, snorted. "That's it, Lieutenant. We got ourselves a tactical doll." Elena kept her hand at her side. She did not defend herself. She had learned years ago that defense implied weakness. She offered data. "My qualification scores are in the file, Lieutenant." Graves looked at the file again. He let it drop slightly, just enough that she had to snatch it from the air. It was a small gesture, petty and deliberate, and it told her everything she needed to know about the next 48 hours. "I don't care about scores on paper targets," Graves said. "We hump 80-pound rucksacks 20 clicks into bad country. If you lag, we don't carry you. We leave you. That is the rule. You understand the rule." I can carry my own weight. Your weight isn't the problem, Graves said, leaning in his shadow, swallowing her entirely. It's the weight of the mission. Don't get in my way. He turned his back on her. The team went back to their banter. The dismissal was absolute. Elena stood on the burning tarmac for exactly 3 seconds, feeling the heat radiating up through her boots and the humiliation radiating inward from every direction. She pushed both feelings down into the same cold place, the same internal room with no windows where she stored everything that would distract her from the job. "Copy that, Lieutenant," she said quietly. To no one but the wind. She walked toward the barracks. Her shadow stretched long and narrow across the ground behind her, sharp as a knife blade. The Tactical Operations Center was refrigerated, artificially bright, and humming with the drone of a generator that vibrated in the chest cavity. In the center of the tent, a projected topographic map of the operational area covered the main whiteboard. The terrain was marked with red lines, coordinates, and elevation numbers, a jagged network of limestone canyons called the Devil's Throat, the kind of geography that looked brutal on a map and was worse in person. Elena stood in the shadows near the entrance when the briefing started, arms crossed, watching. Graves dominated the room the way he dominated everything with physical certainty. He moved to the map and drew red lines through the projected terrain with a black marker, explaining the route with the confidence of a man who had never been wrong. "Alpha 1 and 2 insert here," Graves said, tapping the plateau. "Foot patrol 3 clicks south. Enter the canyon floor at 0200. Target compound against the eastern wall. Rapid entry, secure the HVT extract before sunrise. Clean and fast." The team nodded. To them it was a formula they had run 100 times. Elena's eyes moved to the contour lines around the proposed route. She read terrain the way musicians read sheet music instinctively, and what she was reading made her stomach drop. "Lieutenant." Graves paused. He turned with the slow precision of a man unaccustomed to interruptions. "Questions, Vance." "The route through the canyon floor." She stepped out of the shadows and walked toward the map. Around her, the seals were enormous, and the comparison was almost absurd, but she kept moving. "It's a kill box. Canyon walls give perfect fire positions to anyone sitting on the ridgelines. If you get pinned down there, you have no cover and no exit. We operate under darkness," Graves said, turning back to the board. "Thermal superiority, Reaper drones on station. The meteorological report shows a haboob forming in the next 12 hours. She reached for the laser pointer on the table. A large hand covered it before she got there. Miller, the heavy weapons specialist, didn't look at her. He just leaned his weight on the table and blocked her reach. Elena withdrew her hand slowly. "If the sandstorm hits," she continued, "air support is grounded. Thermal superiority is gone. You're blind in a valley while they hold the high ground." She pointed with her finger instead, directing attention to a peak at the northern edge of the map. "There is an overwatch position at Hill 3050. If I insert early and climb to that ridge, I can cover your advance through any weather. Clean line of sight to the compound and all surrounding cliffs." Graves dropped his marker on the tray. He walked over to her, and she had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact with him. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice dropping to the register that meant this conversation was ending. "This is a direct action raid. Speed and violence of action. I do not need a support element wandering off on a solo hiking trip 3 clicks from the team. I'm not asking you to come get me. Your job," Graves said, and he pointed a finger toward her chest, stopping an inch short, "is to trail the formation watch R6 and stay out of the way. If we need a long gun, we'll ask for it. Until then, you are luggage." "Copy." The tent went still. Elena looked at the map one final time. She looked at the ridgeline that could save them, and then at the men who were too armored in their own certainty to see the geometry of the trap waiting in the canyon below. She stepped forward to point at the critical choke point one more time. Miller shifted his stance, his torso swinging deliberately to block her view of the map. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. "Excuse me," he said without moving an inch. Elena understood then that this was not about tactics. It was about hierarchy. She was not a soldier to them. She was a quota, a liability, a face that didn't fit the uniform they had decided she wasn't qualified to wear. She stepped back. She pulled on the cold professional silence that had kept her functional for years. "Copy that, Lieutenant." Trailing and observing. Graves nodded, satisfied. "Good. Wheels up at 0400. Elena walked out of the tent into the night. The wind was picking up hot and dry, and it carried the first gritty taste of sand on the back of the throat. She stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind reading the landscape ahead of them, warning anyone who knew how to listen. They were walking into a trap. She was the only one who could hear the mechanism clicking. The insertion helicopter dropped them in darkness and noise and was gone before the dust settled. The desert absorbed the sound of the rotors, and then there was nothing but the wind and the creak of gear and the low-clipped voice of Graves ordering the team to move. The pace was not a patrol pace. It was a test. Graves and his men moved with long, fluid strides that ate up the broken limestone terrain, the way large animals eat up ground effortlessly without apology. Elena fell into position at drag the rear of the formation, and she calculated every step against the physics of the terrain and the weight on her back. The Chetak M200 intervention strapped to her frame was 35 pounds of precision equipment, body armor, water survival load, ammunition. She was carrying close to 70% of her body weight across terrain that was trying to twist her ankles with every misplaced boot. 10 minutes in the sweat was stinging her eyes. 20 minutes in her lungs were burning. She focused on the boots of the man ahead of her. Miller, a mountain of a man who moved effortlessly across the shale like it was flat ground. She locked her eyes on those boots and refused to let the gap widen. "Check your spacing, Vance." Graves's voice crackled in her ear. "You're drifting." "Copy," she said, and she said nothing else. She surged forward. An hour in the slope went nearly vertical. The team scrambled up a scree field, and Elena fought for purchase on the loose gravel, the barrel of her rifle snagging on a low branch, her footing sliding back 2 steps for every 3 she gained. Miller paused at the top and looked back. He watched her for a moment. Then he reached out a hand. "Heavy load for a little lady," he said, his voice low. His eyes dropped to her rifle. "Let me take the cannon. You look like you're about to snap." The offer wasn't chivalry. He was giving her a way to become a passenger, to stop being a soldier. Elena slapped his hand away. The crack was sharp and sudden. "Touch my weapon and you lose a finger," she said. Her eyes, dark and fierce behind the ballistic glasses, were steady. "I carry my own kills." Miller blinked. The smirk was gone. He turned and resumed the climb. Elena jammed her boots into the gravel, drove with her legs, and followed. The anger was cleaner than the exhaustion. She burned it like fuel. By the time they crested the ridge, the team went to a knee, scanning the black valley below. Elena looked west. The horizon was gone. In its place was a wall, a solid, suffocating mass of beige and brown that was swallowing the sky from the ground up. It didn't look like weather. It looked like a judgment. "Lieutenant," Elena said into her mic, "look at the sky." Graves looked up. No one spoke for 3 full seconds. Then Elena crouched near a cluster of scrub brush 10 meters to the left and found something the storm hadn't yet erased. A depression in the hard-packed earth. A tire track. She ran her gloved finger along the edge. The impression was sharp, the edges clean. Recent. She moved along the ground and found another, and another. "Lieutenant, you need to see this." Graves sighed and walked over. Miller and Davis hovered nearby. "Tire tracks," Elena said. "Heavy-duty combat tires, not civilian, not a smuggler's pickup. This is an up-armored tactical vehicle. Look at the compression, fully loaded." She moved her hand. "There are overlaps. 3, maybe 4 vehicles. They came through here less than 2 hours ago, heading for the ridgeline overlooking the valley." Graves stared at the dirt. "This is a smuggling corridor. Warlords running guns. The depth says a loaded vehicle. And there isn't just one." She stood up and faced him. The top of her helmet barely cleared his chest rig. "If they were setting an ambush, our drones would have flagged them before the weather turned. We don't have time to hike the peaks. Storm is our cover. We go low, we go fast." Graves turned and raised his fist. "Alpha team on me. Double time." The SEALs moved out, descending toward the canyon floor. They moved with the total confidence of men who believed technology and experience made them invincible. Elena stood still. She looked at the retreating team. She looked at the jagged spine of the mountain to her east. She looked at Hill 3050, dark and severe against the dying sky. The same feeling she had felt in Kandahar before the IED. The particular silence that arrived just before the scream. If she followed them down, she was just another gun in a kill box. If she went up, she was disobeying a direct order from a superior officer in a combat zone. She watched Graves's back until it disappeared into the darkness of the canyon. He wasn't going to listen. He wouldn't listen until the first bullet cracked past his ear. By then, it would already be too late for listening. Elena made her choice. Aid. She did not follow the file down into the canyon. She checked the seal on her optical scope, tightened the straps on her pack, and turned toward the steep, unforgiving face of the eastern cliff. "Going dark," she whispered into the radio. She began to climb. A single shadow detaching itself from the pack, moving upward as the sky fell down and the world below walked into the dark. The rock face didn't care that she was exhausted. It didn't care that her shoulder was already bruised from the duffel strap, or that her fingers were cold, or that a lieutenant colonel's worth of military protocol was screaming in her earpiece, telling her to turn around. The mountain only cared about grip, friction, weight distribution. And Elena Vance understood those things better than she understood most people. Graves's voice hit her ear like a hammer. "Vance, you copy return to formation immediately. That is a direct order." She said nothing. She reached for the next handhold, a lip of limestone barely wide enough for 2 fingers, and pulled herself up another 18 inches. "Vance, if you do not acknowledge in 5 seconds, I am logging this as desertion under fire." She almost answered. The instinct to respond to authority was 22 years deep in her nervous system. But the handhold she was moving toward was crumbling at the edge. And if she split her focus for even half a second, she was going to peel off the wall and fall 300 feet onto nothing. So she did what the situation demanded. She reached up, twisted the volume knob on her radio down to silence, and kept climbing. The quiet that followed was heavier than the noise had been. Without Graves's voice filling her ear, she could hear herself. The rasp of air dragging through her lungs. The creak of nylon straps pulling against the rifle on her back. The scrape of her boots seeking purchase on limestone that was dry and crumbling and deeply indifferent to her survival. She moved with the kind of focus that empties a person entirely. No past, no future. Just the next hold, the next push, the next breath. Being 4 feet 9 inches had been the running joke of her entire career. Boot camp. Sniper school. Every briefing room where she had to stand on the second rung of situational awareness just to see over the people in front of her. But here on the vertical face of a mountain in the dark, with the Haboob building behind her like the end of the world, her size was the only advantage she had. Her strength-to-weight ratio was extraordinary. She didn't muscle her way up the way a 200-pound SEAL would have burning energy against gravity fighting it. She flowed. She found footholds that a size 12 boot would have crushed. She tucked into fissures where a broader shoulder would have jammed and stuck. Her gloves were shredding at the fingertips. The limestone was eating through the fabric and starting on the skin underneath. She felt the warmth of blood making her grip slick. On the right hand, wiped it across her camouflage pants without slowing down, and reached for the next hold. Just another obstacle course, she told herself. But it wasn't, and some part of her knew it. She was alone in a way that had nothing to do with geography. Below her, 7 men were moving into a canyon that was going to become a slaughterhouse, and they had made it clear in every way available to them that her analysis, her instincts, her years of reading terrain and human behavior meant exactly nothing, compared to the fact that she was small and female and came packaged in a body that didn't match the uniform they had decided she wasn't qualified to wear. She climbed anyway. She climbed because the math was simple and brutal. If the vehicles she had tracked were carrying what she believed they were carrying, and if those vehicles had moved to the ridgeline above the canyon, then Graves and his team were about to walk into an L-shaped ambush with no overhead cover, no air support, and no communications once the haboob hit. And there was exactly one person in this entire operational theater who was positioned, qualified, and willing to do something about it. Her arms screamed, her calves burned. She drove herself upward through it. 300 feet up, the wind found her. It had been building steadily, and now it was no longer a suggestion. It was a physical force, a flat, heavy hand pressing her into the wall and then yanking her away from it in alternating gusts that threatened to peel her fingers from the stone. The Chaytak on her back had shifted the barrel, scraping against the rock with every upward lunge, disrupting her center of gravity at the worst possible moments. She pressed her forehead against the limestone for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds of rest. Then she moved again. She didn't know how long the climb took. Time compressed in the way it always did when the body was past its limits and running on something older and less rational than willpower. What she knew was the moment her hand found flat stone at the top the summit plateau, and the difference between vertical and horizontal ground hit her muscles like a mercy she hadn't expected. She pulled herself over the lip and collapsed onto her stomach, gasping. For a moment, she just breathed. The wind tore across the plateau, with nothing to stop it ripping at her ghillie suit, finding every gap in her gear. She turned her face sideways against the cold rock and let the air come back into her lungs. Then she reached for her radio and turned the volume back up. Static. A solid wall of white noise. The haboob had arrived. She rolled to her stomach and crawled to the edge of the plateau. She pulled the drag bag forward, set up the bipod of the Chaytak, and activated the thermal imaging scope. The world transformed. The swirling brown chaos of the storm disappeared, replaced by the clean, monochrome logic of infrared. Heat signatures glowed white against the cooling gray of the terrain. She swept the scope down into the valley floor and found them immediately. 7 distinct shapes. Alpha Team. Stationary, clustered near a boulder formation, bright white against the cold rock. They had gone to ground, which was standard procedure when visibility collapsed. To them, the world was a wall of sand. They were sitting in the dark, waiting for it to pass. They had no idea. Elena swept the scope to the opposing ridge, the one she had flagged in the briefing, the one Miller had blocked her from pointing to, and her breath stopped in her chest. 9 heat signatures were moving along the goat trail above the SEAL's position. Not erratically, not the random drift of animals or shifting thermal currents. They were moving in tactical spread formation, maintaining intervals, carrying themselves with the deliberate economy of people who had done this before. And on their backs were shapes that didn't read like rifles. She increased the magnification. The resolution sharpened. Mortar tubes. Rocket-propelled grenade launchers. At least 2 crew served heavy weapons in the group. These were not smugglers. This was a hunter-killer team. They had used the haboob the exact way she had predicted, moving under its cover to take the high ground above a trapped and blinded enemy. They knew exactly where Alpha Team was. They were setting up to turn that canyon into a crematorium. Alpha 1, this is Overwatch. She hit the transmit button and pitched her voice hard and flat. Break. Multiple contacts maneuvering your east flank. Elevation 200 above you. Distance 400 meters. Acknowledge. Static. Lieutenant Graves, do you copy? Ambush is imminent. Move your team. Nothing. Just the storm eating the signal. She watched through the scope as the enemy team stopped moving. She watched them lower the tubes from their backs. She watched the heat bloom of a mortar baseplate being set into the hard-packed earth, the metal absorbing body warmth and radiating it back at her scope. They were leveling. They were preparing elevation. They were running their own calculations. In 90 seconds, maybe less, the first round would drop. Elena looked at her rifle. She looked at the range indicator on her scope. 3,050 meters. She had taken long shots before. She had trained at distances that made other snipers uncomfortable. But this was not a range qualification in controlled conditions with no wind and a stable platform. This was a rock ledge at altitude in the middle of a sandstorm, with gusts hitting 45 knots and a crosswind variable that changed direction every 8 seconds. At this distance, the bullet would be in the air for nearly 4 seconds. In 4 seconds, the wind could push a projectile 40 feet sideways. 40 feet at 3 kilometers was not a miss. It was a ghost. The bullet would simply cease to exist in any meaningful relationship to its target. She tried the radio again. 3 more attempts, varying her frequency, varying her language, using short burst transmissions that were more likely to cut through the ionization of the storm. Silence. Static. The hiss of the atmosphere laughing at her. She looked down at the SEAL's heat signatures. She looked at the enemy team beginning to arm the first mortar round. She looked at the empty air between her muzzle and the man who was going to kill Graves and every one of his team in approximately 60 seconds. There was no one to ask. There was no chain of command available. There was no validation coming from any direction. There was only the physics of the shot, the variables she could control, the variables she couldn't, and the absolute clarity of what happened if she did nothing. Elena exhaled slowly. She moved her body into the stock of the rifle, settling her weight, precisely spreading it across the platform of her hips and chest, in the way that turned a human body into a stable shooting system. She pulled the ghillie suit tighter against the wind. She activated the ballistic computer on her scope and began feeding it data. Temperature, altitude, barometric pressure. The density altitude reading was extreme. At this elevation, the air was thin enough that the bullet would behave differently than at sea level, carrying farther before drag began to win. She factored the spin drift of the projectile. She factored the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, which at this distance was not theoretical. It was measurable. It was real. She factored the humidity content of the sandstorm itself. The numbers the computer gave her back were not reassuring. They were simply honest. She dialed the turret adjustments in feeling the clicks through her fingertips. Then she looked at the wind. The wind was the variable no computer could fully solve. She had to read it herself the way her instructors had taught her, and the way the instructors' instructors had taught them, watching the movement of debris at the midpoint of the trajectory, reading the pressure against her exposed cheek, identifying the rhythm of the gusts, and finding the pause between them. There was always a pause, not a stop. The storm wouldn't stop. But there was a breath in the chaos, a microsecond, when the gale gathered itself before the next push. She had to find that breath. Below, the enemy mortar team lifted the first round. She could see it clearly in the thermal scope, the shape of it heavy and cylindrical, the heat of the man's hands warming the metal casing. He was raising it to the mouth of the tube. Graves was going to die in 20 seconds if she didn't fire. She was going to miss the shot if she rushed it. Both of those things were simultaneously true. Elena did not move. She locked every voluntary muscle in her body into stillness and waited for the breath in the storm, the pause she needed, the one that would give her half a second of stable conditions in the middle of a weather event that was trying to erase the entire valley. She felt the wind change against her cheek. A fractional shift, a drawing inward, the storm inhaling. There. Sending it, she whispered. She squeezed the trigger. The CHATAC. M200 intervention did not make a polite sound. It was a controlled explosion, the muzzle brake channeling, expanding gases sideways, and kicking up a halo of dust and grit around her position. The recoil hit her shoulder like a closed fist, driving hard into the muscle, reverberating through her collarbone and into her spine. The bullet left the muzzle at supersonic speed and disappeared into the storm. 1 second. 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4. Through the scope, the thermal image of the mortar loader jerked once violently. The round tumbled from his hands. He folded downward with the specific, terrible completeness of a body from which all intention has been removed at once. The mortar round hit the dirt unfired. Elena cycled the bolt. The spent brass casing spun away and rang against the limestone beneath her. She was already moving her crosshairs to the next target. The radio operator with the whip antenna. The man currently kneeling behind a rock that protected him from everything except a shot coming from directly above. She exhaled. Below in the valley, Lieutenant Graves heard the first explosion of enemy fire and dove for cover. He pressed himself into the dirt and waited for the mortar round that never came. He waited for the explosion that did not arrive. And then, through the chaos of machine gun fire and screaming wind, he heard something else. A distant flat crack arriving seconds after it should have carried wrong by the storm. And he saw a man on the ridge above him drop without being shot by anyone below. Graves looked up. He looked at the peak of hill 3050 shrouded in the swirling brown of the haboob. He looked at the angle of the impact. He thought about the trajectory. He thought about the distance. He thought about the woman he had called a doll and a liability and luggage, and then turned his back on. Vance, he breathed. The name sat in his mouth like iron, like something he couldn't swallow and couldn't spit out. High above him, Elena Vance was already on her third target. The third target went down before the second man's radio finished sparking. Elena cycled the bolt with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had made peace with what she was doing. Not with pleasure, not with hesitation. With the specific terrible calm of a person who has accepted that the math of the situation leaves room for exactly one outcome. She was the only variable in this equation that could change the result. So she changed it. 3, she whispered. Her voice was dry. Her lips were cracked from the altitude and the cold. She didn't notice. Through the thermal scope, the enemy squad was fracturing. The clean tactical formation they had maintained coming up the goat trail was gone. Men were scrambling behind rocks, shouting at each other, trying to locate the source of the fire. They were looking down into the valley, tracking muzzle flashes from Graves's team, assuming the kills had come from below. The geometry was wrong, and it was going to take them precious seconds to figure out why. Elena gave them no seconds. She moved the crosshairs to a man standing upright, gesturing with his arm, pointing directions at the others. Squad leader. The one giving orders was always the one who kept the unit functional. Remove him, and the unit stopped being a unit. It became a collection of frightened individuals. She exhaled. She squeezed. The squad leader dropped mid-gesture. His arm was still extended when he fell. 4 down. The panic that followed was immediate and visible in the thermal imaging, the remaining heat signatures lurching, colliding, scattering. Men who had been calm and methodical 60 seconds ago were now firing their weapons at clouds. Actual clouds. Spraying rounds into the storm above them at an enemy they couldn't locate, couldn't understand, couldn't see. Elena felt something shift in her shoulder. Not pain exactly. Something deeper, a structural complaint from the muscle that the recoil kept finding with every shot. She ignored it. She cycled the bolt. She found the next target. Down in the valley, Lieutenant Graves had stopped waiting for the mortar round that was never coming and started paying attention to what was actually happening. He pressed his back against the rock shelf and risked a glance upward through the chaos. The enemy fire from the ridge above him was becoming erratic, panicked. The disciplined, overlapping suppression of a prepared ambush was collapsing into random noise. Miller, Graves said, grabbing the big man's arm. Count the contacts on the ridge. Miller swung his night vision up toward the enemy position. He watched for 10 seconds. He lowered it slowly. Lieutenant, Miller said. His voice had a quality in it that Graves had never heard from him before. They're dropping. I count 4 down on that ridge, and nobody is shooting at them from our side. Graves said nothing for a moment. His shoulder wound had soaked through the field dressing Davis had slapped on it. The pain was a steady, hot presence that made clear thinking a deliberate act. He looked at the angle of the bodies on the ridge. He calculated the trajectory the way his training had taught him to calculate it. He traced it backward through the storm, past the valley floor, past the eastern cliff face, all the way to the peak of hill 3050. The shot distance from that peak to the ridge was not a number he wanted to say out loud. She's still up there, Davis said quietly. He wasn't asking. Graves keyed his radio. He tried voice first. Vance, give me a sit rep. Static obliterated everything. He switched to clicks. 2 sharp breaks in the squelch, the universal signal for listening. He sent it 3 times and waited. 3,000 meters above him, Elena heard the rhythm in the static. Faint, barely threading through the atmospheric interference, but intelligent, not random. She pressed her transmit button. "Lieutenant." Her voice came out thin and distorted but intact. "Enemy regrouping north. Your east flank is open. Move to the 3 o'clock ridge. I will clear the path." In the valley, Graves went completely still when he heard her voice. Not because it surprised him that she was alive, because of how she sounded. She wasn't asking for instructions. She wasn't reporting to a superior. She was directing the engagement with the flat total authority of someone who could see the entire board and had already decided the next 3 moves. The old instinct fired up hard. He was the officer. He gave the orders. He made the calls. He looked at Miller changing a belt on his saw with hands that were shaking slightly. He looked at Davis checking the medic bag. He looked at the men around him trained and capable and currently fighting blind in a hole, while someone with eyes was telling them exactly where to go. He swallowed the pride. It went down like gravel. "Copy Overwatch," Graves said. "Moving east." He turned to the team. "You heard her. On your feet. East Ridge. Move." The SEALs didn't question it. They trusted Graves. Right now, Graves was trusting the doll. They broke cover and ran low and fast across the open ground between boulder formations. 30 meters into the move, a single enemy fighter rose from concealment in the scrub brush directly behind Miller. A K-47 up, tracking Miller's exposed back. The man had been playing dead or hiding since the squad leader fell, waiting for exactly this moment. High above Elena caught the heat bloom of the figure rising. She didn't think. Thinking took too long. She moved the crosshairs, applied a fractional lead, and fired. The round arrived before the man finished raising his weapon. He dropped into the scrub without firing a single shot. "Clear," Elena's voice said in Graves's ear. "Move." Graves pushed Davis forward. "Move, move." They reached the eastern ridge and went to cover, breathless but whole. For the first time since the ambush began, they had elevation, they had a defensive position, and they had a sniper 3 kilometers away who could see everything the storm was hiding from them. "Overwatch," Graves said into the radio. "We are at the East Ridge. 5 personnel, 1 wounded. What is the enemy status?" A pause. Static. Then Elena's voice, rougher now. 4 confirmed remaining on the north face. They are pulling back from the mortar position. I think they're going to regroup and try to flank you from the low ground." "Copy. Can you hold them?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I can hold them," Elena said. She did not tell him about her shoulder. She did not tell him that the recoil of the Chaytak had found the same bruised muscle 5 times in a row and was now producing a deep structural ache that made operating the bolt feel like pulling a knife through wet concrete. She did not tell him that her fingers were bleeding steadily inside her shredded gloves, and that the cold at this altitude was making the blood congeal between her knuckles in a way that stiffened the joints. She told him she could hold them because she could hold them. The rest was not relevant information. She swept the scope north and found the 4 remaining heat signatures regrouping behind a rock formation 200 meters from the SEAL's new position. They were low-moving, carefully, no longer panicking. Someone among them had steadied the group. Had identified the direction of the threat. Was thinking. Elena felt the change in the situation before she could fully articulate it. The enemy squad had gone from panicked to methodical again. That was dangerous. Panicked men fire at clouds. Methodical men solve problems. She found the new leader, identified him by his positioning slightly behind the group, directing movement with hand signals rather than putting himself forward. Smart, survivable behavior. She moved the crosshairs to him. The wind shifted. She adjusted. Fired. The round hit stone 3 feet to the left of the target. The man dove flat and didn't come up. Elena's jaw tightened. 5 down in terms of threat management, but the leader was alive, and now he knew the angle of fire. The game had changed. She cycled the bolt and looked at her remaining ammunition. 3 rounds of standard. 1 round of armor-piercing incendiary. She had been burning through the magazine with the clinical efficiency the situation demanded, and had not noticed the count dropping until this moment. 4 rounds left. 4 targets minimum. She had to stop missing. The sound came before she processed what it meant. A deep mechanical rumble, low and resonant, pushing through the howl of the storm. It vibrated in the rock beneath her chest. Elena swung the scope toward the northern end of the valley, following the sound, and felt her stomach drop completely. A vehicle was materializing out of the dust. Heavy. Fast. The thermal signature of its engine block was enormous, blazing white in the scope. An upper-moored Land Cruiser with the roof cut away and a DSHK heavy machine gun mounted on the bed. The gunner was already rotating the barrel, sweeping it toward the SEAL's position on the eastern ridge. Elena hit the transmit button. "Technical," she said, and this time she didn't keep the calm. There was no time for calm. "Heavy technical inbound, 12 o'clock. It's heading straight for your position." In the valley, Graves heard the engine. He came up from cover for 1 second, saw the shape of the vehicle through the swirling dust, and dropped back down. "Vance, take the shot. Take the shot right now." "Stand by. Stand by, Vance. It has a DSHK. If that thing opens up on us from 50 meters, we are gone. Take the shot." "Stand by, Lieutenant." She was tracking the vehicle. The driver was experienced, swerving around obstacles, changing his line constantly. She had her armor-piercing incendiary in the chamber. 1 round, 1 chance. At a moving target doing 40 kilometers per hour on broken terrain at 3 kilometers of distance. She had to lead it by a distance equivalent to predicting where it would be 4 seconds in the future. She tracked it. She read the driver's pattern. She watched the way he navigated around rocks, the micro-hesitations before obstacles, the slight deceleration before impact. She found his rhythm. Then she saw it. A narrow gap between 2 large rock formations directly ahead of the vehicle. The driver would have to straighten his line and brake fractionally to thread through it. 1 moment of predictable trajectory. Elena shifted her aim to the gap. She held on the empty space where the engine block would be in approximately 4 seconds. The DSHK on the truck began firing. Heavy rounds tore into the rock around the SEAL's position, and Graves heard Davis cry out as stone shrapnel cut across his forearm. They were flat on the ground, unable to return effective fire against the armor. "Vance." Graves's voice cracked completely. Raw. Stripped of everything except the biology of a man who does not want to die. "Take the shot, or we are done. We are done right now." The truck entered the gap. The nose dipped 2 degrees as the driver touched the brake. Elena squeezed. The recoil found the bruise in her shoulder and drove straight through it. Her vision blurred for half a second from the pain. She pulled her eye back to the scope. 1 second. The truck was accelerating out of the gap, the DSHK gunner swinging the barrel back toward the SEALs. 2 seconds. The round was somewhere in the middle of 3,000 meters of turbulent air and physics and probability. 3 seconds. Graves rolled to his side and grabbed Davis by the collar, pulling him toward the deepest part of the rock shelter, putting his own body between his man and the incoming fire. 3.6 seconds. The armor-piercing incendiary round struck the engine block of the Toyota just forward of the firewall. It punched through the radiator, shattered the cast-iron engine casing, and ignited the fuel lines in a single catastrophic sequence. The thermal scope went white as the vehicle's heat signature expanded outward in a blooming flower of energy that consumed the entire frame. The truck did not simply stop. It somersaulted. The explosion drove the front end upward, and the kinetic force and the secondary detonation of the ammunition stored in the cargo bed finished the job. The vehicle came down on its roof in a cascade of fire and twisted steel. Elena pulled her eye from the scope and pressed her forehead against the cold stock of the rifle. She was breathing in short, shallow bursts. The shoulder was past pain now. It was a separate entity, a hot structural complaint from her body that she was filing away for later. "Target destroyed," she said into the radio. She heard Graves's voice come back, and for the first time since she had met him on the tarmac, with his condescension and his easy contempt, she heard something in it that was not performance. "Good kill," he said. The disbelief was naked in his voice. "Good kill, Vance." She was already looking back through the scope, because the burning wreck was a beacon now. The flames were casting light up the canyon walls, and light meant angles, and angles meant that someone with enough patience and intelligence could trace the trajectory of that last shot back to its origin point. She watched the surviving enemy heat signatures and saw exactly what she had feared. 3 of them had stopped looking at the burning truck. They were looking up at the mountain. Their heads were tilted back. Their bodies were orienting toward the eastern cliff face. They were solving the geometry. Elena pressed her transmit button. "Lieutenant," she said. Her voice was quiet now, controlled in the way that control costs something. "I am compromised. They have my position." A pause from below. Then Graves's voice, low and careful. "Can you move?" She looked at the cliff behind her. She looked at the only path down from the summit, the narrow goat trail that crested the plateau from the east. She looked at the 3 heat signatures that had stopped moving away from the mountain and started moving toward it. "Not down," she said. "Not fast enough." She released the transmit button and pulled herself back from the ledge. She moved toward the goat trail. She moved toward the sound of men who were climbing up to kill her with the specific focused anger of people who have watched their friends disappear one by one from a direction they couldn't see. She had 4 rounds left in the rifle, and the rifle was now useless for what was coming. She dropped the drag bag, shrugged off the weight, and reached for the M18A1 Claymore mine in her pack. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She had been underestimated her entire life. She had been dismissed, mocked, blocked, and discarded. She had climbed a mountain alone in a sandstorm and held a canyon together with a bolt-action rifle and 4 seconds of courage, repeated 9 times. The men climbing toward her right now did not know any of that. They thought they were hunting a lone sniper who had run out of options. They were about to learn the difference between running out of options and choosing the last one deliberately. She jammed the Claymore's scissor legs into the rocky soil at the crest of the trail, aimed the convex face downward, toward the climb, unspooled the firing wire, and backed against the far wall of the plateau, with the clacker in one hand and the Sig Sauer in the other. She waited. The mountain was silent, except for the dying wind. And then she heard boots on stone. The boots got louder. Elena pressed her back against the stone wall and controlled her breathing the way she had been taught. 4 counts, in 4 counts, hold 4 counts out. Her right hand gripped the M57 firing device. Her left hand held the Sig Sauer with the muzzle pointed at the crest of the trail. The clacker was cold and solid, and exactly as heavy as a decision that cannot be taken back. She could hear them now. Not just boots. Breathing. The heavy, ragged respiration of men who had been climbing hard at altitude and were running on adrenaline and fury. 3 of them. She had counted 3 heat signatures breaking away from the group and moving toward the mountain. 3 men who had watched their squad get dismantled one by an invisible hand from the sky and had decided that finding that hand and destroying it was worth the climb. She understood the feeling. She didn't hold it against them. The first hand appeared over the edge of the plateau, fingers gripping the lip of the rock. Then a second hand. Then a head, wrapped in a shemagh eyes scanning the plateau fast and hard, the way eyes move when the body knows it is entering a dangerous space and the brain hasn't caught up yet. The man pulled himself up and over the edge and stood. He saw her immediately. He stopped. He was expecting a fortified position. A team. At minimum, a fighting hole and sandbags and the muzzle of something serious pointing at him from cover. What he found instead was a single small figure pressed against the far wall of the plateau, holding what looked like a plastic box in one hand and a pistol in the other. Her dark brown hair was loose around her face, now the elastic lost somewhere on the climb. Her camouflage pants were torn at both knees. The white of her sports bra was visible at the collar of her shredded gear where the ghillie suit had been stripped away. She was bleeding from a cut on her cheek that had been there so long it had crusted over with dust. Confusion crossed the man's face. It lasted exactly 1 second. Then he started to raise the AK-47 and shout back to the men behind him. Elena squeezed the clacker 3 times. The explosion was not large by military standards. The M18A1 Claymore was a focused weapon designed to deliver its payload in a 60-degree arc across a specific kill zone. But on a limestone summit at altitude in the confined space of a plateau edge, the concussive effect was catastrophic. 700 steel ball bearings shredded everything in front of the device in a fraction of a second. The blast wave hit the unstable limestone of the cliff edge with enough force to fracture the rock along stress lines that had been waiting for exactly this kind of invitation. The edge gave way. There was no scream. There was only the sound of the mountain deciding it was done, tolerating the situation. A deep cracking groan followed by the roar of tons of limestone breaking free and sliding downward, taking everything on that section of trail with it. The lead climber, the two men behind him, the goat trail itself. Gone. Erased. Swallowed by the cliff face and the storm below. Elena was already moving away from the wall when the overpressure hit her. It picked her up and threw her backward into the stone. Her head connected with the rock wall behind her, and the world went white, then gray, then a ringing, nauseating nothing that lasted 3 seconds and felt like 3 hours. She slid down the wall and hit the ground hard, her legs folding under her. Debris rained down. Fist-sized rocks, pulverized limestone, a cloud of fine particulates so thick she couldn't see her own hand. She lay there and breathed. Dust that tasted like concrete and burned coming in and went out the same way. Her ears were producing a sound that had nothing to do with the external world, a high sustained tone that swallowed everything else. She moved her fingers first, then her arms. She got a hand under herself and pushed. The world spun. She let it spin and pushed anyway. She made it to sitting. She looked at her right leg. The rock that had struck her thigh during the blast had done something unpleasant to the muscle. The leg was there. It moved when she told it to. But the message between her brain and the limb was traveling through static, arriving delayed and partial. She could stand. She wasn't sure for how long. She found the Sig Sauer 2 feet away and picked it up. She checked the chamber by feel because her vision was still resolving from the concussion. Brass. Good. She keyed her radio. Overwatch to Alpha 1. Her voice came out slurred at the edges. She didn't like that. She tried again. Overwatch to Alpha 1. Summit is clear. 3 enemy KIA. Trail is gone. I am... She stopped. She made herself be accurate. I am mobile, but compromised. What is the status of the extraction? Static. Then Graves's voice, tight and immediate. Vance, what was that explosion report? Claymore, Summit Defense, 3 down. She looked at where the trail used to be. The goat path is gone. I don't have a way down. A pause, longer than she wanted. How bad are you hurt? I'm functional. That's not what I asked. She looked at her leg. She looked at the blood on her face that she could feel more than see. She thought about the shoulder that had stopped sending pain signals 20 minutes ago, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. I'm functional, she said again. Another pause. She heard Graves talking to someone away from the mic, the clipped, rapid exchange of men making decisions under pressure. Then his voice came back clearly. We are at the extraction point. Bird is inbound. ETA 4 minutes. Vance, I need you to find a way down, right now. The trail is gone. Then find another way. She looked at the cliff behind her. She looked at the shattered edge where the goat trail had been. She looked at the slope below the summit, the loose scree field that the explosion and the rock slide had torn open and left in a chaotic, unstable cascade of broken stone that dropped nearly vertical for 500 feet before flattening into a manageable grade. It was not a path. It was not navigable by any reasonable definition of that word. She thought about it for 4 seconds. She tightened the straps on her pack. The Chaytak went back over her shoulder because she was not leaving it on this mountain. She found a flat slab of limestone roughly the size of a cafeteria tray and picked it up. She keyed the radio one more time. Coming out, she said. She didn't step to the edge. She jumped. She hit the loose shale and the world became pure physics. The slope caught her, and the slope did not slow down. She was moving at speed immediately, the scree sliding under and around her in a wave of broken stone that she was simultaneously riding and fighting. She used the flat slab as a brake against the slide, dragging it behind her to slow the descent. She used her heels to steer, jamming them sideways to redirect momentum away from the exposed rock faces on either side. The Chaytak barrel was catching against the slide and threatening to torque her sideways. She locked her elbow against it and held the line. The wind hit her. The slope steepened. She was going too fast. She leaned back hard, driving the slab deeper into the scree, and felt the deceleration in her teeth. The slope began to level. The loose stone became larger rocks, more stable with gaps she could use to arrest the slide. She hit one with her right heel, bounced left, hit another, and the momentum finally gave up its argument with her, and she came off the bottom of the slope, tumbling, arms wrapped around her head, the way she had been taught, rolling through the impact across the flat ground at the base of the cliff. She came to rest. She was aware of several things simultaneously. The ground was flat. She was breathing. Her leg was screaming at her through the static it had been operating in for the last 10 minutes. The rotor wash of a helicopter was pressing dust against her face from somewhere close. She tried to get up. The leg said no. She settled for getting to one elbow. Movement on the slope. Miller's voice 50 meters away, loud, urgent. She heard boots hitting the ground hard, running, 2 sets fast. Then Miller was there, and Davis was there, and Miller, the man who had offered to carry her rifle like she was a child. The man who had leaned on the briefing table to block her from the map dropped to one knee next to her and got both arms under her without hesitating for a single second. "I got you," he said. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, because to him she did, and he held her the way you hold something that matters. "I got you, doll. Don't let go." The nickname landed differently this time. It had no edge. It had no contempt. It sounded like what it had become somewhere between the tarmac and the summit and the valley floor, where she had kept every one of them breathing. It sounded like the name you give someone who has earned a place in the story you tell for the rest of your life. "My rifle," Elena said. "Davis has it." "He better not drop it." "He won't drop it." Miller ran. Elena held on. The Blackhawk was right there, rotors screaming, the crew chief hanging out the side door, waving them in with both arms. The pilot's voice was cutting through the radio inside the bird, something about fuel temperature and departure windows, and the word now repeated 3 times. Graves was standing outside the door. His left arm was in an improvised sling made from someone's field bandage. His face was the color of old concrete. He watched Miller come across the open ground carrying Elena, and he didn't say anything. He stepped aside to make room, and he put his good hand on Miller's shoulder as the big man loaded her through the door, and that hand stayed there for a moment, in the way hands do when words are completely useless. "Go," Graves said. He climbed in last and pulled the door shut, and the Blackhawk lifted hard, nose pitching forward, climbing fast and angry out of the devil's throat and into the dirty brown sky above the storm. Davis was already moving across the cabin floor on his knees, his medic bag open. He reached for Graves's shoulder, first, the reflex of training pointing him toward the officer. Graves shook his head and pointed at Elena without speaking. Davis nodded and shifted. Elena tried to wave him off. She got her hand about 6 inches off her lap before it stopped cooperating. Davis gently moved it aside and got to work. When he cut the fabric away from her thigh and got a look at the bruising and the lacerations underneath his expression, did something careful and professional that meant he was controlling a reaction. He pressed antiseptic into the wound, and Elena's head went back against the fuselage wall, eyes shut, jaw locked. She did not make a sound. Across the cabin, Miller was sitting with his head in his hands. After a moment, he raised his face and looked at her. He looked at the Chaytak lying across her lap, nearly as long as she was tall, scratched and dusty with the barrel darkened from repeated firing. He looked at her hands, still wrapped around the receiver, the gloves shredded to the first knuckle, the fabric soaked dark with blood that had dried and dried again over the course of the climb, and the shooting and the slide. She had not let go of the weapon. Not once. Even now, in the semi-conscious aftermath of a concussion and blood loss, and the particular kind of exhaustion that lives on the far side of the body's ability to complain, her hands were still on the rifle. Miller reached over and tapped the arm of the SEAL next to him. He pointed at Elena's hands without saying anything. The man looked. He looked for a long time. Then he looked back at Miller, and neither of them said a word because there was nothing available in the language they operated in for what they were looking at. Graves watched all of it from the opposite side of the cabin. The pain in his shoulder was real and constant, but it was not the sharpest thing he was feeling. The sharpest thing was a recognition that had no comfortable shape to it. The understanding that he had looked at a fully qualified combat-ready specialist with 9 confirmed kills at a distance that most ballistic charts didn't bother to list, and he had seen a mascot, a doll, a logistical liability. He had turned his back on her analysis, blocked her access to the planning map, called her luggage to her face, and then led his team into the exact ambush she had identified in the briefing, with a laser pointer she wasn't allowed to touch. Every man breathing in this cabin was breathing because she had disobeyed his direct order. He sat with that for a while. The helicopter banked and the light changed, and the storm fell away behind them, and he sat with it the whole way. Elena opened her eyes somewhere over the flat terrain south of the operational area. The ringing in her ears had dropped from a scream to a low hum. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin and breathed and took inventory. Concussion. Certain. Thigh injury significant but not structural. Shoulder bruised deep into the muscle functional. Hands, she flexed them carefully functional. She turned her head and found Graves looking at her from across the cabin. He held her gaze. He raised his good hand slowly and pressed 2 fingers against his chest directly over his heart. Then he extended them toward her. It was not a regulation gesture. It was not in any manual she had ever read. It was the gesture of a man who had run out of adequate language and was doing the best he could with what he had left. Elena looked at him for a long moment. Her expression gave him nothing easy. She had not done this for his approval, and she was not going to hand him the comfort of a smile that absolved him of the 48 hours that preceded the last 4. What she had done because it was the job, because the math demanded it, because 7 men were going to die if she stayed on the canyon floor and played by the rules of a hierarchy that had already decided she didn't belong. But she also understood something about the gesture that went beyond the individual. She understood that a man who could make that gesture after being wrong in the specific way Graves had been wrong was a man capable of being different. And in the world she operated in, that was not nothing. She gave him a single small nod. Then she closed her eyes again. The Black Hawk flew south. Below them, the Devil's Throat was already filling back in with blown sand covering the evidence of the night smoothing over the burned truck and the collapsed trail, and the 9 places in the terrain where the geometry of the fight had been decided by a woman 4 feet 9 inches tall, who had climbed a mountain alone because someone had to. The base medical bay smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and the particular silence that settles over a place where people are being put back together. Elena sat on the edge of an examination table while a flight surgeon named Reyes worked on her thigh with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this too many times to be dramatic about it. The overhead light was very bright. After hours of thermal imaging and sandstorm dark, the brightness felt almost aggressive. "You're going to feel this," Reyes said. "I already feel it." "I mean more." He was right. She gripped the edge of the table and breathed through it, and did not look at what he was doing. She looked at the wall instead. Beige canvas, a laminated safety poster, a clock that read 0340 hours. She had been awake for nearly 24 hours, and her body was loudly filing the paperwork on every one of them. Reyes worked for another 10 minutes in silence. Then he sat back and stripped off his gloves. "The shoulder," he said. It wasn't a question. He had already seen how she was holding it. "It's fine." "Specialist Vance. The shoulder." She let him look. He pressed 2 fingers into the trapezius muscle, and she felt the pain travel down her arm and back up into her jaw, and she kept her face completely still. You have a level 2 muscle tear and significant contusion to the posterior deltoid, Reyes said. Whatever you were shooting it too many times without adequate padding. I was shooting it the right number of times, Elena said. The number the situation required. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something on his clipboard. You're grounded for 72 hours, he said. Understood. I mean it. If I see you picking up anything heavier than a coffee cup before Thursday, I will personally confiscate your rifle. You'd need both hands, Elena said. Reyes almost smiled. Almost. He rapped her shoulder, gave her instructions she was already planning to partially ignore, and left her alone in the bay. She sat there for a moment in the quiet. The adrenaline had been gone for over an hour now, and what it left behind was a bone-deep fatigue that made even sitting upright feel like a negotiation. Her hands were bandaged from the knuckles to the wrist. Her thigh throbbed with a slow, reliable pulse. Her head was producing a low-frequency ache that Reyes had confirmed was a mild concussion and treated with the universal military prescription of rest and fluids and time, none of which the operational schedule generally accommodated. She thought about the shot. The first one. The mortar loader on the ridge with the round already in his hands. She thought about the 4 seconds the bullet had been in the air, and what those 4 seconds had contained. The math, the wind, the decision to fire at empty space and trust the calculation to deliver the round to a point where a man and a bullet would arrive simultaneously from opposite directions. She thought about what would have happened if she had stayed on the canyon floor like she was told. She picked up her water bottle with her bandaged hand and drank half of it and put it down. The door opened. Lieutenant Graves walked in. His left arm was in a proper sling, now the field dressing replaced by actual medical work. He was in clean clothes. He had washed the desert off his face, but he hadn't managed to wash out what was sitting behind his eyes, which was something heavier and less temporary than fatigue. He stopped just inside the door. He looked at her sitting on the table with her bandaged hands and her wrapped shoulder and the particular stillness of a person who has stopped performing anything for anyone. You should be in a bed, he said. Reyes already covered that. And I'll get there. He moved to the chair against the wall and sat down. Not the posture of a superior officer conducting a check-in. The posture of a man who needed to sit down and wasn't sure what came next. He was quiet for a moment. The clock on the wall moved from 0341 to 0342. I went to see Colonel Sterling tonight, Graves said. Before I came here. Elena said nothing. I told him the after-action report was incomplete. He looked at his hands. I told him that the mission success belongs to you. 9 confirmed kills, 3,050 meters. In a haboob. I told him all of it. He paused. I wrote it in the file myself. Put my name under it. Elena looked at him steadily. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. He said it without hesitation, without the softening of a man looking for credit for doing the right thing. He said it the way you state a fact. You told me about the canyon. You told me about the vehicles. You told me about the ridge. 3 separate times in 3 separate conversations, and I treated every one of them like you were reading from a manual you didn't understand. He stopped, looked at the wall. I put my men in a kill box because I was too arrogant to hear you. Your men are alive. Because you disobeyed my direct order. He looked back at her. If you had followed it, we'd all be buried in that canyon right now. Every one of us. The silence that followed had a different texture than the silences that had come before it. The earlier silences between them had been weighted with contempt, with dismissal, with the particular density of a hierarchy enforcing itself. This one was just 2 people in a small room at 4 in the morning after something that had nearly gone completely wrong and hadn't. I need to ask you something, Graves said. Ask. When I turned my back on you at the briefing, when Miller blocked the map. He stopped, started again. You knew you were right. You knew the geometry of that ambush better than anyone in that tent. And you still walked out without making a scene. He shook his head slowly. How do you do that? How do you stay that controlled when people are treating you like your furniture? Elena considered the question. She considered it genuinely the way she considered all problems that deserved an honest answer. I grew up doing it, she said. When you spend your whole life being the wrong size in every room, you learn that losing your temper is a luxury. It feels good for about 30 seconds, and then it's the only thing anyone remembers about you. She looked at her bandaged hands. I learned to let the work speak. The work doesn't have a gender. It doesn't have a height. It just has results. Graves was quiet. He absorbed that. The results spoke, he said finally. They always do, Elena said. If you live long enough. He stood up. He stood in the way he always stood, filling the space, a physical fact. But something in the architecture of it had changed. The certainty that had looked like confidence on the tarmac 48 hours ago looked different now. Not smaller. More honest. He extended his good hand. She looked at it. She reached out her bandaged hand and shook it. Get some sleep, specialist, he said. You too, Lieutenant. He left. The door closed behind him. Elena sat for another moment in the quiet, then carefully lowered herself off the table and moved toward the recovery ward. The chow hall the following evening was exactly as loud as it always was. 300 people eating dinner on plastic trays, the percussion of silverware and conversation bouncing off canvas walls that didn't do much to absorb anything. Elena had spent most of the day horizontal, following Reyes's orders with more compliance than she usually managed, because her body had made it clear that the alternative was not available. She carried her tray to the corner table, back to the wall, the habit that never broke. She sat down and looked at her food and started eating and did not look around the room because she already knew what the room looked like, and she was too tired for the specific performance of not noticing things. The door opened. The noise level shifted a slight collective reorientation, the way a room moves when something that commands attention enters it. SEAL Team Alpha walked in. They moved through the chow hall the way they always did, big and deliberate, drawing eyes. They usually went straight to the large center table, the one that put them in the middle of everything, where they could hold court and take up the space they felt entitled to take. They didn't go to the center table. A tray hit the surface directly across from Elena. She looked up. Graves, clean PT gear. Still favoring the left arm, but managing the tray one-handed with the practiced ease of a man who had been adapting to discomfort his whole career. He didn't ask permission. He pulled the chair out and sat down. Then Miller. Then Davis. Then the rest of them pulling chairs from surrounding tables with the noisy, unself-conscious scraping of large men who were not concerned about the attention they were drawing. They arranged themselves around her corner table until she was surrounded, not hemmed in, surrounded in the specific way that means the people around you have decided you are worth surrounding. The entire chow hall was watching. Elena could feel it without looking. Miller settled into the chair to her left. He opened his milk carton with the focused energy of a man completing a very important task. He looked across the table. He looked at her bandaged hands and the bruising visible at her collar, and the cut on her cheek that Reyes had closed with 2 small strips of tape. Pass the salt doll, Miller said. The word arrived, and it was not the same word it had been on the tarmac. The sound was identical. The meaning had made a complete journey from one end of the human spectrum to the other. It wasn't a dismissal anymore. It was an adoption. A call sign that a team gives to the person who has become so undeniably part of them that they need a word that belongs only to that person and them. Elena held his gaze for one beat. Then she reached out, picked up the salt shaker with her bandaged hand, and slid it across the table to him. There, she said quietly. Graves unwrapped his silverware. Davis poured himself water. The conversation started up around her, the banter and the jokes, and the half-finished stories that military people tell each other, because the complete versions are too large for a dinner table, and it included her not by announcement, not by formal declaration, but in the natural, unself-conscious way of people who have decided the circle is bigger than it was yesterday. Someone made a joke she didn't catch. Someone laughed. Miller said something about the technical, and whether the explosion had technically counted as a clean kill. And Davis said it absolutely did not. And the argument that followed was loud and entirely without heat. Elena ate her dinner. Her shoulder hurt. Her hands hurt. Her head maintained its low, persistent commentary about the concussion. Outside the mess hall windows, the desert was going dark again, the sun pulling its light back over the horizon and leaving the operational area to its habitual nighttime business of being vast and indifferent and full of things that could kill you. She thought about the mountain. She thought about the moment she had turned away from the descending file of seals and looked at the cliff face and made the only decision that the situation left available. She thought about the climb, the cold, the blood on her hands, the shot that had been in the air for 4 seconds, while 7 men waited to find out if the math was right. The math had been right. It was always going to be right. She had run those numbers 1,000 times in 1,000 different conditions, and she knew what she was capable of before anyone in this room had said a single word to her. The mountain had not taught her what she was worth. She had known that. The mountain had simply provided the conditions under which everyone else was forced to learn it too. Colonel Sterling's paperwork was already moving through channels. Graves had made sure of it. Her name was on the action report above 9 confirmed kills at a distance that the ballistics community would be discussing for years. The citation was formal and accurate, and would follow her career like a second shadow. But none of that was what she felt sitting in the corner of a loud chow hall with 7 large men who had decided she was one of them. What she felt was simpler and older than any of it. She felt like a soldier among soldiers. Finally. Completely. Without condition or asterisk or the silent constant qualification of people who needed her to be smaller than the job required. She took a bite of her dinner. Around her the conversation rolled on, easy and warm, the specific warmth of people who have been through something together that they will carry for the rest of their lives. Elena Vance was 4 feet 9 inches tall. She was 22 years old. She had long dark brown hair and hands that were currently wrapped in medical gauze and a shoulder that was going to hurt for 6 weeks. She was the smallest person in the room by every measurable dimension, and when the last light of the desert sun came through the mess hall windows and stretched the shadows of the soldiers across the far wall, her silhouette was indistinguishable from the giants around her. She had not needed them to see her clearly. She had needed them to look. They were looking now. That was enough. That had always been enough.